Hey guys, welcome back to another very exciting tutorial here at the PhotoshopTrainingChannel.com. My name is Jesus Ramirez and you can find me on Twitter at JR from PTC. In today's tutorial, we're going to be talking about creating the cinematic effect using color grading techniques in Photoshop. Usually the term color grading is reserved for film, but these days a lot of people are using that term for photographs as well. You might have also heard it referred to as creative color correction, and that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to take this image and give it the look of a summer blockbuster. But before we get started, we got to talk about the differences between color correction and color grading because they're very important to this process. And to explain it a little bit, we're going to click over just for a minute onto this file that I've created. And as you can see, this is the color wheel. We're going to talk about it in a moment. But before we do, I want to show you some still images so you can see the effect that we're going for. This is a still of the movie Terminator Genesis, and as you can see, this is the movie look that you might be familiar with. And just to point out, the color scheme that a lot of these films have is teal tint in the shadows and an orange color in the highlights, mostly in the skin tones. And this is because they're complementary colors. And as you know, when complementary colors are put side by side, they pop and they stand out. In this case, they make the actor stand out. That's one of the reasons why that particular color scheme is used for movies. I'm going to show you another picture. This is a still from the movie The Hobbit. And as you can see, it's a very similar effect. You'll see a lot of teals, greens, and blues in the dark areas. Skin tones are usually not affected. We want to have a natural skin tone. And by the way, there's no real rules as to what color it should be. This is up to you and the story that you're trying to convey by adding this color grade. There's another image here of a still from the movie Jurassic World, and as you can see, again, blue, teals, in the dark areas. And the lights, especially the skins, do not have that blue tone. Here's another still from the movie The Matrix, and this is a little bit more exaggerated. The skin tones actually do have some of that green tint, but as you can see in the shadows, the green is really noticeable. And the still is from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and as you can see, it's the same color scheme. Teal in the dark and orange in the lights. This is the reason why we had the color wheel earlier. The yellows, orange, reds, and magentas are usually where you find the skin colors in, and the opposite of that are the greens, teals, cyans, and blues. If you don't have a color wheel, I'm going to show you a little trick. You can go into color.adobe.com and you get this color wheel here. You can click on complementary, and if you find a color that is similar to a skin tone, and I'm just going to find one here really quick. I may not be too exact on this, but I mean, we'll just say that this color here is the color of skin. You'll notice that the opposite color is this cyan color, and no matter what, maybe even that pink could be a skin tone, then we have green. And if we move over and, this could also be a skin tone. So as you can see, the cool colors are all in the opposite end of the color wheel when it comes to skin tones, and they're complementary, which is why colorists use this color scheme for their movies. So what we're going to try to do in Photoshop is to replicate that effect. Now, how does this relate to color correction? If you're going to apply the color grade to an image, it is usually a good idea to have an image that has neutral grays. That means that there's no color cast on the image that you're going to be working with. Now, this is not a color correction tutorial. I have a tutorial on color correction. If you go to my website, photoshoptrainingchannel.com, and you go into photoshoptrainingchannel.com/curves color correction, or you can just search for color correction and color matching with curves and type that in the search bar, you'll get this tutorial where I talk about color correction and color matching for about 30 minutes. But just in case that you don't know how to do color correction, I'm just going to do a really quick color correction on this image. And if you're going to color grade this image, we would first need to remove the green color cast. And one of the easiest ways of removing the green color cast is with the curves adjustment layer. So I just created a curves adjustment layer on top of that. And if I click on this icon here on this eyedropper, I can set the dark point on my image. If I click on this handle here, and hold Alt, Option on the Mac, and drag, you see how the image, it just gets this weird color. So you see cyans and greens and yellows. But if I keep dragging to the right, at some point you'll see where the image starts turning black. And those should be the dark points of my image, and that's where I want to click. So somewhere along the left wheel. So I'm just going to click on that. and that sets the black point. And notice right away how much better my image looks. And I'm going to do the same thing for the white point. So I'm going to click on the white point eyedropper, hold Alt, Option to the Mac, click and drag, and this time I'm going to click and drag to the left. And wherever I see my image turn white, that's where my lightest point is going to be. And I got to be careful that it's not a specular highlight. I want it to be a white that does have some detail in it. And in this case, it's probably around here. So I'm just going to click there for now. And now I'm going to click on whatever I think my gray point should be. Anything on my image that I think should be a neutral gray. So it could even be this white here. So I'm just going to click on there. And this is probably pretty neutral. And one way to tell if your image has a color cast or not is by grabbing the eyedropper tool, clicking on the info panel, and going over an area that should be a neutral gray. So in this case, if you see here, right over here, there's going to be two numbers. The numbers here on the left represent the numbers before the adjustment layer, and the numbers on the right are going to be the numbers that represent the image with the adjustment layer applied to it. So if we hover over the white, you'll see that it's red of 164, green of 161, and blue of 163. And that is pretty neutral, and I could tell that there's no color cast on the image. Now, there is a slight color cast here in the shadows, and we can fix that by going into the curves if we wanted to, but that's not the point of this tutorial. So for the most part, this is a good image to work with. It's a lot better than what we started with. Now, one thing before we get going, one way that you can tell if an image has a color cast is what I just showed you. And just to emphasize that point, I'm just going to show you how that works. If we have a neutral image, notice the RGB numbers here. And I'm just going to get rid of this adjustment layer just so we see one set of numbers when we hover over the gradient here. Notice that the red, green, and blues have exactly the same numbers in this area here. That means that there is no color cast. Now I'm going to hover over this image here. Notice that in this case, no matter where I hover on this gradient on the left side, the red is always higher. That means that there is a red color cast on this gradient. And with this gradient on the right side, we have something similar, but in this case, the blue is highest. So therefore, there's a blue color tone to the image, or it could be green or a combination of two colors. But if you want it to be a neutral gray, the number is going to be identical or as close to identical as possible. Sometimes that's not possible, depending on your image. But anyway, now we're going to get into the color grading of our image. And just to remind you, what we're going to do is we're going to have the teal in the darks and the oranges in the light areas, especially in the skin tone, so our subject pops out of the image and it creates the cinematic effect that we're used to and seeing in a lot of movies. And you know what? One thing before I get started that I did want to bring up is if you are going to be working with video, then I wouldn't use Photoshop for that. I know Photoshop can handle video. And if you apply adjustment layers onto a video, you can render that out. But if you're going to be doing color grading, Adobe actually has a tool called SpeedGrade CC, which is available to you if you're a member of the Creative Cloud. So if you're a member of the Creative Cloud, Adobe has a program that is designed just for color grading video. So you might want to take a look at that if that's something that you're interested in. But anyway, so how do we color grade an image in Photoshop? As I mentioned before, one of the things I'm going to recommend you do is to color correct your image. As you can see, there's a lot of neutral grays on this image. If I hover over, for example, on this pillar here, you'll see that the red, green, and blues are actually very, very close. They're 89, 88, and 88. If I hover over his suit, maybe in this area, 63, 60, and 66. So still pretty close, not as close as there on this pillar, but overall, this image does not have a color cast. So that's what I'm going to start with. What I'm going to do first is create a curves adjustment layer. I'm also going to delete the layer mask just to keep things more clean and you can see what's going on. I'm going to name this curve color because this is going to affect the color. And I'm going to create one more curve, and this one is going to affect the luminosity, the luminance values of the image. I'm also going to delete the layer mask, and I'm just going to name this luminosity. So now I have two curves, color and luminosity, and we're going to start with luminosity. So I'm just going to put luminosity at the bottom. So the color curves adjustment layers on top, luminosity is at the bottom. I'm going to click on this little eye icon to disable it. Even though I haven't made any changes, I just want it disabled so we know that we're working only with luminosity. Now, why did I name this luminosity? Is to remind us of what this layer is going to control. And this is going to control how dark or how light the pixels in our image are. So you'll notice that if I create, for example, an S curve, it darkens the image, but I'm actually going to make this an extreme case just so you can see what happens. So the image is darker and lighter in the lighter areas, creating higher contrast. If I zoom in into the image and then zooming in by holding Alt and using the mouse wheel, that's Option and mouse wheel on the Mac. Now, one downside of doing the curves in a normal blend mode is that it also affects the colors of the image. But if I only wanted to affect the lightness values, I can change the blend mode to luminosity, and notice what happens. The image is still dark, but the colors are not affected. It just makes them darker without increasing the saturation of the image. So that's what we're going to do. The curves layer that controls the luminosity, we're going to change the blend mode to luminosity. And I'm going to disable this for now. And for the color, you probably guessed that already. If we start changing the different alpha channels and increase the red, we don't want the luminance values to be affected. So we're going to change that into color, and you'll notice what happened there. Normal, you see how the image was lightened because I drag this up. It lightens the colors, but I don't want the colors to be lighter. I just want to add the color. So change that to color, and the luminance values stay, but the colors go up, which is what I want. So I'm just going to click and drag on that point and drag it out just so I have a straight line again, and I'm going to bring it back to RGB just for now. So I'm going to disable the layer just by clicking on the eye icon, and I'm going to enable the luminosity layer, and that's what we're going to be working with. And I'm going to click and drag these out, and that way we're going to start with a clean luminosity adjustment layer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to first of all zoom out, and we're going to look at our image. And what I want to do is I want to increase the contrast and make the background much, much darker, like so. And by the way, I don't want you to try to duplicate exactly what I'm doing in terms of the inputs and outputs and try to get the exact curves and numbers, because for your image, it may be different. And in fact, it will be. All images are different. So just look at generally at what I do and try to tweak it so it matches your image. For example, on this image here, most of the data is in the dark pixels, as you can see. This is what this graph is showing us. You may have an image where the data is in the lighter pixels or in the midtones or all across the spectrum. So if you duplicate exactly what I do to the curve, it may affect your image differently. So keep that in mind. Oh, and by the way, you can download this file and follow along with this file once and then apply it to your own projects. But this file is available for you to download and play with. And this is a composition that I created using several stock photos. But anyway, so I'm going to click and drag down on this curve, and this is going to make the darker pixels even darker. If I want to lighten up the lighter pixels, I can just click and drag this up, and I'll do this for now just because I think this may work, but we can always change our mind and come back if we want to. So now I created contrast in that image like so. I think the luminosity is okay for now, so I'm going to click on color, enable that layer, and now we're going to be playing with color. So if you remember in the examples that I showed you, the darks had a blue teal effect to it, and these skin colors were not affected at all. In fact, they stand out. So we're going to try to create something similar here. So how do we create a teal color in the background while leaving the colors in the face intact? Well, we're going to use the RGB channels for that. We're going to start with the red channel. If I click and drag this to the right, it takes away red. What that means is that it adds cyan. If I click and drag this to the left, it adds red. If I click on this point and drag it up, it adds red. If I click on this point and drag it down, it adds cyan. So how do you know what happens when you click and drag these points? The opposite of red is cyan, the opposite of green is magenta, and the opposite of blue is yellow. But how do you know that? How are you going to remember that? Well, one tip I can give you is clicking on the info palette, which is this palette here. You can go into Window and Info if it's not enabled, and you'll see here your RGB. Red, opposite is cyan. Green, opposite is magenta. Blue, opposite is yellow. That's one way you can remember. So we're going to start with the red channel, and we're going to add some cyan to the dark areas. And I'm going to click and drag and place this point here in the middle because I don't want to add any color to the lights. Well, actually I do. I want to make them redder. So I'm going to click and drag this point in the top over to the left. And now you see how the shadows got a cyan look to them and the lights got a red look to them as well. I'm going to click on green and I'm going to drag up just to add a little bit of green and maybe drag this over to the left just to add a little magenta on the lights. I'm also going to click on this curve and bring that back to the middle. So the middle stays the same. The darker pixels get green and the lighter pixels get magenta. Now I'm going to go into the blue channel, click in the middle again, and I'm going to add a little bit of blue to that. And I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to the light colors, like so. So before and after, just so you can see what we've done there. And from this point on, we can start playing around with different parts of the image. For example, if I think there is too much red, for example, on his face here, I can click on this icon here, come to the part of his face where I think there's too much red, and you'll notice a circle appear right around this area as I drag it along his face. And I can click, and it's going to create a point. Then I can use the arrow keys on the keyboard if I want to bring that down. So it just takes a little bit of that red away. If I want to go back into the green channel and add more green, I can click on that point and just use the arrow keys to adjust it. Actually, it has enough green. Maybe it needs a little bit less green. I'm trying to get that teal color, and I think this is working fine. So as you can see, we're almost there. This is obviously more blue than what we got going here, but I wanted to go for more of the teal look and the orange look. And like I said before, there's no right or wrong. It all depends on the story that you're trying to convey and the look that you're going for. So you don't have to get it exact. You can change it, or you can do whatever you like. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use a channel mixer just to create a more interesting look. And the name of this adjustment layer is actually very descriptive. It mixes the channels. So before I get started, let me just get rid of this layer mask just so we can keep things clutter-free and things don't distract you. So with this adjustment layer, you have different presets. For example, if I click on black and white infrared, you see what happens here. There's negative 70% of the red channel, 200% of the green channel, and negative 30% of the blue channel. The blue filter, no red, no green, 100% blue. And the total is down here at the bottom. You can have higher than 100% if you wanted to, but usually try to stay around 100%. And there's different ones, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for one of these presets that sort of gives me the best contrast of my image, and I think I'm going to go with black and white with orange. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to bring the opacity down all the way to 0% and then just bring it up to maybe something like that. And once I'm here, I can go back and change my presets, and maybe another one will work better. Actually, I'm kind of liking the one with the red filter just because his face stands out more. So maybe that's what I'll use, and maybe I'll bring the opacity down because that's a little too strong. But you can use the channel mixer to desaturate your image and give it more contrast as well. And once you've gotten to this point, you can also make other changes. You can maybe subtract colors from this channel. Maybe it's got too much red and you want to add some green or subtract some blue. It all depends on what you want to do, but I'm just going to stick with what I had before. And you know what? I'm looking at it. It still looks a little too dark, so I'll even maybe line it more. I think that works. Notice how red the face is, and it's a little too dark, and if I add this channel mixer, it takes away that red and it lightens it. So that's what I want to do. I'm going to put all these adjustment layers into one group. So I'm going to shift click on the top one while holding shift. I'm going to click on the bottom one, Control G, Command G to turn that into a group. And I'm just going to name this grade because we applied a color grade to it. And you can see the before and the after. Now this was done using two curves adjustment layers. And if you find curves adjustment layers hard to use, I recommend that you spend the time learning them because they're really, really powerful. And it's pretty much the only adjustment layer for color correction that you'll need if you learn how to use them. Now, if you're a beginner and you're just starting and all this sounded very confusing, there is another way you could do this that's a little more visual, but I don't think the results are as good. So let me show you what that is really quick. Use a selective color adjustment layer. And again, I'm just going to delete the layer mask to keep things clutter-free. What this adjustment layer allows you to do is to add cyan, magenta, yellow, or red, green, and blue to any one of these colors. So for the blacks, we want to add cyan, so we're going to increase that. We don't want any magenta. We want to take the magenta away, so we're going to add some green. We don't want to add any yellow, so we're going to take that away, which gives us blue. And the image is a little washed out, so we're going to increase the blacks, like so. And you know what, maybe a little less yellow and a little less magenta, something like that. and maybe increase the blacks even a little bit more. So if you notice, we added blue, green, and cyan to the blacks, to the dark pixels, which is what we did earlier, just in a more controlled way. This might be a little bit easier to see, but the result is not as good in my opinion. Then we can do the same thing to the neutrals. Reduce the yellow, reduce the magenta, which adds blue and green. Maybe add a little bit of cyan and make these colors darker. Of course, I'm going a little fast. Maybe you can get these colors a little bit better if you took your time. And I don't want to do anything to the whites. Now I'm going to go into the reds. I don't want any cyan in the red, so I'm going to bring that down. Maybe add a little bit of magenta, maybe add a little bit of yellow. Just I'm looking at the face here. That's what my real concern. And just find a nice skin tone, and maybe do the same in the yellows. Maybe bring the cyans a little down, add a little bit of magenta, add a little bit of yellow, something like that. And I know it's oversaturated, but we're gonna fix that in a moment. And we're gonna do what we did before by adding the channel mixer, and I'll delete the layer mask, and I'm gonna go into the presets, and we'll choose the same one we used before, which is the red filter, the black and white with red filter. And we'll bring down the opacity. And as you can see, it gives us a very, very similar effect. And just so you can compare, I'm just gonna go into Window, History, and I'm gonna click on Grade, enable that, disable the other group, add a snapshot, disable it, enable this one, add a snapshot. So this is the first color grade that we did, and this is the second. So they're very close, very similar, but there is a whole lot more control when you use curves adjustment layers to create your color grades. So I would recommend learning curves, even though using something like selective color might be a little bit easier. Now, believe it or not, there's another way of doing this. It's a whole lot easier by using a color lookup adjustment layer. What a color lookup adjustment layer allows you to do is to use LUT files, LUT files, which are lookup tables. That software that I mentioned earlier, SpeedGrade, uses color LUTs. They're sort of like presets that allow you to add color grades to the video. And Photoshop has some built in. We have all of these, and we have, I'm just going to scroll through them really quickly so you can see the different ones that are available in Photoshop. One of my favorites is Film Stock, but this does not have the color effect that we were applying earlier, but this one does, teal orange. I want to select that one, and this is the effect that we get, a teal orange effect. Now, if you compare that to the rest, and to compare, I'll do what I did earlier. I'm going to open up the history panel, click on snapshot. So now we have the color grade that we did manually. We have the one that we used the selective color adjustment layer, and we have the one that we created using the lookup adjustment layer. So as you can see, they're all very similar, but using curves has the greatest control. Second would be the selective color adjustment layer, and third would be the color lookup table, simply because you really don't have any control. If you wanted to change the color lookup adjustment layer, you would have to add other curves adjustment layers, and maybe change the luminosity or change the different colors. Then why start with a color lookup adjustment layer? You can just use curves. Now, don't get me wrong, I use color lookup adjustment layers all the time, but for a specific color grading effect, there's nothing better than using curves. And you have the control of coming back and making any change that you want. And maybe if you want less green to have more blue, then you can do so. So I'm going to go back into the blue channel and increase that blue. So notice how this now has a blue tone to it, and maybe this is not as bright as we would want it to be, and actually maybe that's a little too much blue, and maybe something like that. And then maybe add more red to the face, maybe change the yellow a little bit, and I think I maybe even need some magenta. But anyway, as you can see, this is a completely different look that we easily achieve by just changing the curves in the color adjustment layer. And just for fun, I'm just going to add another snapshot. So this is the blue version, and this is a green version. So as you can see, you can create many different color grades using curves adjustment layers. Okay, and that's it for this tutorial. As always, I hope that you learned something new. If you have any questions, feel free to leave your message down below. And don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter where I send you an email notification every time I put up a new tutorial and a tip of the day roundup every Monday morning. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Once again, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.